Welcome everyone to the kickoff event in the School Cities Climate and Justice and Cities Speaker Series. Today, we have Youth for Climate Justice. I'm Karen Chappell, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the School Cities and Professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. We're thrilled to have you all with us today to hear these incredible champions of climate justice. Today's event is hosted in partnership with Fridays for Future Toronto, and we thank them for helping us bring this conversation to you this afternoon. When we first started talking about a speaker series at the School Cities, we knew that it would be important to elevate and honor the voice of young people who've been so very effective in raising awareness about climate change around the world. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Then the land was stolen and the people were displaced. Though for many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, this meeting place is still home. So we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and we acknowledge the land as a way to express that gratitude and to honor the Indigenous people who have lived and worked on this land historically and presently. It allows us the opportunity to appreciate the unique role and relationship that each of us has with the land. But we at the School of Cities are keen to move beyond acknowledgement towards action. We want to support different ways of thinking about land. We need to increase understanding of how land ownership has led to wealth and to privilege through systemic and historic inequities. We need to make these inequities more visible through data and analysis. We need to support different ways of knowing, different ways of thinking about land, and we need to learn from Indigenous peoples. For Indigenous people, land and water are regarded as sacred, as living relatives. People are of the land, and the land is of the people, and they are inseparable. We need to find more effective ways of telling the stories of people, ways that will be meaningful no matter what your background. At the School of Cities, as part of our commitment to action, we've supported several initiatives at the university and in our community that focus on combating anti-Indigenous racism. We also support Indigenous faculty, students, staff, and communities around the world, and we try to include Indigenous voices, perspectives, and ways of knowing in all of our outreach and educational activities. Staff will post some links in the chat so you can learn more about our work. The School of Cities is a community of scholars from many backgrounds, races, and ethnicities. We recognize that the weight of educating people, changing mindsets, and altering actions cannot rest solely on Indigenous and racialized communities, communities that bear disproportionate burdens economically, socially, in the justice system, and as COVID-19 has made so painfully obvious, also in public health. It's a collective responsibility and a collective imperative. The School of Cities pledges to redouble our efforts to move beyond acknowledgement and towards action through our scholarship and practice, and we invite you to join us. Now, some housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. Please submit your questions through the Q&A or in the YouTube comments, and our staff at the School Cities will do our best to make sure our speakers can answer as many questions as possible. There's closed captioning enabled at the bottom of your screen using the CC button. Now it's my great privilege to briefly introduce our speakers. You can read more about them on our event page at schoolcities.com. Joining us today is Kekasham Basu. She's an award-winning global influencer, environmentalist, champion of women and children's rights, TEDx speaker, climate reality mentor, author, musician, peace and sustainability campaigner. She's also a University of Toronto student, majoring in environmental studies and minoring in women and gender studies along with physical and environmental geography. Kekoshan is the founder president of the global social innovation enterprise Green Hope Foundation, which works at a grassroots level in 25 countries. Welcome, Kekoshan.
Thank you.
Next, we have Naomi Leon. Naomi is in their first year at the University of British Columbia studying sciences. Naomi organizes for climate justice education with Climate Education Reform BC and with Sustainability in Metro Vancouver. As an Asian queer person of color, Naomi aims to decenter the white perspective in the environmental movement and works to actively dismantle elitism, white supremacy, and all forms of colonial violence that take form in herself and her community. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you.
Next, we have Autumn Peltier. Autumn is an incredibly decorated 17-year-old Anishinaabe and citizen of the Wikwemikon unceded territory, Manitoulin Island, a First Nation of the Anishinaabe Nation member, currently residing in Ottawa, Canada. Autumn is a water warrior who's been advocating for the protection of Nibi and Mother Earth since she was 7 years old. She's gained international recognition and even been the subject of a documentary, The Water Walker, about her journey to address the United Nations in New York City. Autumn remains focused on bringing to the forefront the attention and need for clean water across First Nations. Welcome, Autumn. Moderating today's discussion is Professor Jessica Green, Associate Professor of Political Science with a cross appointment in the School of Environment at the University of Toronto. Jessica studies the ways that global institutions, both public and private, can provide environmental public goods. She's written and spoken extensively on environmental politics and policy, been published in journals Global Environmental Politics, and many more, and she blogs regularly for the Washington Post. Welcome, Jessica. And I'll now turn it over to Jessica and our panel.
Well, thank you very much. I am actually here to really facilitate the voices of our three excellent speakers. So I will turn it over to Kekoshan, who's going first.
Great. Thank you, Professor Green. Hello again, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Kekoshan. I am the founder president of Green Hope Foundation, and I'm also a United Nations human rights champion. And I'd like to begin by saying that the climate justice movement has been happening for years, led by young people and women, and primarily from the global South. But the thing is, now the media, and particularly the Western media, has picked up on one thing, the flashiest thing, which is the striking and protesting by young people, making this the face of the youth climate movement. And that has led to the tokenization and stereotyping of all young people as just strikers and protesters, blaming the government, hurling insults, creating a negative environment, especially when the pandemic has shown us how important it is to come together and work together. And these strikes, in turn, have taken the attention away from where it should rightfully be to people, and especially young people, bringing about change on a day-to-day basis at the ground level to mitigate climate change. And I can say this because that is exactly where my work is centered across our 26 countries and with over 225,000 young people globally. And that has evolved over the last 15 years when I embarked on my crusade for climate justice as a 7-year-old. And these are the very invisible people and communities whose plight and daily struggle for survival are unseen to most in the Western world. So we must begin to address climate change from both a human and planetary lens. And that has been my mantra through Green Hope Foundation, because our work focuses on negating the impacts of climate change as an inequality multiplier by bringing about behavioral change through our 600 plus environment academies, peer-to-peer learning centers for resilience building, through skills-based learning on adaptation techniques, for instance, where we empower women and young farmers to practice climate smart agriculture by installing solar irrigation systems and training them on organic farming and composting, and enabling them to create local circular bioeconomies to build resilience. And coupled with that, we recognize the myriad challenges that they face along with climate change that are exacerbated by climate change. And we do our best to mitigate those by, for instance, installing deep bore tube wells in communities to provide these climate vulnerable areas with clean arsenic-free water, building toilets in homes and schools in LDCs and small island developing states so that the girls and women especially have safe spaces both in their homes, and when the girls go to school have safe spaces there as well. And this circular economy in turn provides opportunities of self-reliance. For example, we've built sewing schools in several countries that we've started in extremely conservative climate vulnerable communities during this pandemic to ensure that women and girls have a stable source of income, and so that they can send the girls with that money to our solar powered schools and then give them our climate resilience and computer literacy education that ultimately leads to social equity and the restoration of ecological balance in these communities. And additionally, we've also installed solar streetlights to ensure that when these women and girls come to our evening classes, they feel safe at night, and it actually reduces the risk of sexual harassment and assault. Now, none of these hundreds of thousands of young people from these impacted communities within whom we work have ever protested or marched on the streets, because how can they when all they can think about is their next meal? How can they miss school on a Friday when they don't even have access to education? And if they do, they wouldn't miss it for the world. And we've seen how this lack of education has worsened during the pandemic, and combined with the impacts of climate change-induced disasters, it is not even documented how many children, and especially girls, have had to permanently drop out of school. And what's worse is that the pandemic has amplified the digital divide, where those who were in school now cannot access online learning. So we try our best to rectify these problems by installing routers in homes in both urban and rural settlements globally. And our solar-powered mobile libraries are taking books directly to the doorstep of over 250,000 children across India, Bangladesh, DRC, and Liberia to ensure that these children don't miss out on their education. And these are the millions who are on that side of the web. And ironically, they're the ones least responsible for anthropogenic climate change, as we know. And it's these millions whose plight must be at the forefront of the climate justice movement. Because as responsible and empathetic global citizens, we cannot continue to distract ourselves with the rhetoric, thinking that just by playing the blame game, we've done our bit, and give ourselves a pat on the back every single time we shave a few data points when we're calculating our carbon emissions. And while we must continue to hold our parliamentarians accountable for delivering on their promises and creating just policies, we must also hold ourselves individually accountable as well, because our individual actions or inactions, the choices we make, impacts carbonization. We need behavioral change, and it starts with each individual. We must amplify the sharing and understanding of grassroots experiences and actions, and take actions on the ground ourselves so that we can really shift our awareness of climate change from an abstract phenomena of just carbon levels and future impacts to something that is more tangible, multi-layered, and intersectional issue, and bring together these myriad social, economic, and environmental struggles and solidarities. And this requires a multidisciplinary and an intergenerational effort. It cannot be a siloed campaign. It has to accumulate gender, racial justice, education, peace, and disarmament into this call for humanity and equity, because this is one battle that we cannot afford to lose. So we who have had the privilege of getting an education must use that to act and create change in our own zones of influence and understand the power of the individual through passion, honesty, hard work, optimism, and most importantly, empathy for people and planet. And only then can we achieve climate justice. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. Next, we have Naomi. Naomi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just waiting for my presentation here, but a huge thank you to School of Cities and to all the other panelists who I deeply respect. I'm so glad to be here. And so, yeah, my name is Naomi or Puyan. I use they, she pronouns, and this is a little bit about my climate story. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so a little bit about me. I'm a Chinese Malaysian settler on unceded, stolen, and unsurrendered Musqueam, Tsawwassen, and Cowichan First Nations territories. And I'm an organizer for racial and climate justice. And I think something that really stopped me from joining the environmental movement for a long time was this narrative of like, what power do I have to create change? And so I think that questioning of myself and what I could bring to the environmental movement really stopped me. And so I want to encourage anyone who might feel the same way, that you are absolutely valued, needed, especially queer people and people of color. I would just encourage you that you do belong in the movement and that you're absolutely valued. And so, yeah, the work that I do is primarily with two organizations, one being with sustainability teams. We are similar to Fridays for Future Toronto, but except locally to Metro Vancouver in British Columbia. And we organize primarily around electoral politics, so mobilizing policy decision makers and people with power really to not only to like pass policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but to also have that focus on climate justice and harm reduction. So with people who are hurt most by climate change now, like Kekashan said, well, climate striking is just one aspect of taking climate action. And I think it's something that has often been centered, but really, I think, as I'll get into later in the presentation, it can't just be the only focus. And so some ones that we have had are helping to pass the Vancouver Climate Emergency Action Plan, as well as mobilizing people to climate strikes in 2019 and to various different actions after that. And so why specifically climate justice is important to ask. Well, the exclusionary history of the environmental movement, and often in its present day, has been really apparent in how inaccessible it's been, how elitist it's been, and how it's been rooted really in white supremacy, how it's lacked intersectionality, and how it's tokenized Indigenous voices, Black voices, people of color, and youth in the movement. And I think there's this huge tendency to really center, as Kekashan said really well, to center these flashy things. So like white voices really like striking the streets with these bold things like that. But I think it's really important to not only like to acknowledge how the media tends to center like whiteness and how really this needs to change, and how it also tends to criminalize Indigenous land and water defenders and other people of color as who are also fighting for climate justice. And so I think that's why it's important now to center on how we really need to listen to Indigenous leadership, and how it's not just about climate striking, but it's about solidarity amongst within the movement, and it's about listening to Indigenous solutions as science, and it's about listening to how Indigenous people have been saying since millennia that decolonization is a climate solution, how really all the fight against colonial violence is really a fight for climate justice. And And that's why in our stand for climate justice, we must also include Indigenous sovereignty, land back, Black liberation, Asian justice, queer liberation, gender justice, housing justice, migrant rights, justice for the global South, who is often most affected by climate change, and really justice and equity for all people. And so, yeah, this is really because there's no climate justice without racial justice, without gender justice, without queer liberation, and without all the things that I mentioned before, because our liberation is really tied together. And so the second organization that I organize with is called Climate Education Reform BC. We are a youth movement across so-called British Columbia advocating for climate justice education to be taught in K-12 schools. And so we're mobilizing our BC Ministry of Education to really treat the climate emergency like the emergency that it is, as well as to have that curriculum reform and staff training and resources for teachers. You can learn more here at our website, but I'm just gonna quickly go through it right now. And really, climate justice is an opportunity to equip students with knowledge and organizing skills to face the climate emergency, but also to process climate emotions collectively, because eco-anxiety, feelings of overwhelmed, feeling like we can't do anything in our power is often what stops youth from acting, which is why I think it's so important to process our emotions collectively so that we can then have these overwhelming emotions, but then use them to act instead of letting them stop us from acting. And so that's why I think climate justice education is also really an opportunity to provide hope to people and to help people be involved in community solutions. And so this is absolutely our fight for love, joy, and liberation. Oftentimes it's easy to root our advocacy in feelings of shame and guilt and like we're not doing enough. But I think, changing this narrative to how we get to be a part of a collective movement and how we get to be a part of fighting for each other is, I think, what is so powerful. And so a big thank you. And thank you. This is an art piece I made, by the way, about the world we get to create, but yeah.
Naomi, thank you for that fantastic and inspiring presentation. I love hearing about solidarity. It is so important, and thank you for sharing that. So our last speaker is Autumn Peltier. Autumn, are you there?
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
Oh, awesome. Okay, Autumn, the floor is yours.
Wait, can you see me?
Yes, we
I'm not
can.
too sure if you guys
Yep.
Okay. Well, Bojo, Musqueam Kwe Dishnakas, Magisidodem, we Kung Donjiba, Miniswindan, we Medewayan. My name is Autumn Pelche. I'm 17 years old. I'm an Indigenous rights activist and, of course, a water activist. I'm also the Chief Water Commissioner for Anishinaabe Nation, and I've been doing my work since I was 8 years old. And I like to say I've been doing it for longer than I can even remember because this is just the way I was raised, the lifestyle I was raised in. My work has a lot to do with the Indigenous and cultural perspective of a lot of Indigenous issues in Canada. I focus on clean drinking water issues in First Nations communities, racism, systemic racism, environmental racism, really just Indigenous issues in general. And I started when I was 8. I used to live in my home community, Wikomakongo, Manitoulin Island, and I attended school there, of course. And at the time, there was they called it the Native Language Speaking Contest, and basically the idea was to write like a speech about what you felt most passionate about, and like kind of like what you just using your voice in general. And I wrote mine about like Indigenous issues, the environment, and like the water. And we had to say it in like our native language. And so that's what I did for 3 years until I was 10 years old. And when I was 10 years old, I was invited to the Children's Climate Conference in Södertälje, Sweden, I think 2015 at the time. And this was my first time speaking on like a large platform. And this is kind of where like I felt most passionate about using my voice on larger platforms and like actually like speaking up about these issues, because I wasn't really aware of like the political or like more of like the issues a child wouldn't really know about at the time. And that's when I really started to like learn, and my like people would like help me learn and realize, I guess. I started learning about like how Indigenous people were treated in Canada, and even from my own experience, I started to realize it and experience it on my own. And a lot of that had to do with like experiencing the First Nation stereotypes. And because my personal experience, I just moved to Ottawa about 3 years ago now, and when I first got here, the first things that were said to me was, "Oh, are your parents alcoholics? Are your parents drug addicts? Are you poor? Do you live in a teepee?" And those are stereotypes that's racism that I've experienced firsthand. And I started learning more about missing a murdered Indigenous woman, and that's another thing that I feel very, very passionate about, and I advocate for and use my voice for. And of course, clean drinking water issues. I don't know why I didn't mention this one first, actually, but um, I learned about these when I was 8 years old, and that's why I started raising my voice and using my voice, because I was attending a water ceremony in a First Nations community not far from mine, and I wasn't aware of what a boil water advisory was, or I wasn't aware that like my people could not drink their water or have access to it. And so I had to use the washroom this day, and when I went to the washroom, all over the walls it said, "Do not drink the water. Do not wash your hands with the water. Not for consumption." And like I seen boil water advisory, and so 8-year-old me asks my mom, like, "What does all of this mean? Why can't I drink the water, or why can't I wash my hands with the water? Why do I have to use hand sanitizer after I use the washroom?" And so my mom explained to me that the community that we were in was had been on a boil water advisory for over 25 years. And I didn't really I still really didn't understand what that meant. So that same night I went home and I was researching and Googling and watching speeches of like chiefs talking and explaining what boil water advisories were. And that was a really big eye opener for me. Like, I don't know why it was so important to me, or it stood out so much to me at 8 years old, but it was in that moment where I realized that like kids were the same age as me, and there was kids that were younger than me, babies, not realizing what it was to like, they didn't realize what it was like. They didn't know they were growing up in a community where they couldn't drink the water. And I guess it really also affected me because like having to raise your families on bottled water or waters that you have to go walk and get on your own, like that's a lot of work to do, especially if like, for example, you're a single mother or you're a child or you're an elder. That's a lot of work. And for me, that really impacted me a lot, knowing that that's the issues that my people face in the country that we come from, a country that's known as a first world country, where like we have to live like this, we have to experience this type of stuff, we have to deal with this, and these issues are not talked about. This is why I speak up, because these issues are not talked about and like at all, and that's why I use my voice. And yeah, these issues are not talked about, so that was a really big eye-opener for me, that moment. And of course, learning a lot more about Indigenous issues and experiencing them again firsthand is what really keeps me going, I guess. Thank you.
Autumn, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Really powerful stuff. It's really just, I'm not going to say much except for that it's really an honor to share a virtual stage with you all. I am just floored by the work you do, and thank you for your hope and your service and your struggle. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to kick it off with a couple of questions for you, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A from the audience. You've all talked about the work that you do really powerfully. I'm a political scientist, so I'm sort of curious to hear a little bit more about what you think And Naomi, you spoke to this, I think, a fair bit, but what your model of change is. Like, how do you think we're going to create the amazing worlds that you all envision of greater climate justice and sustainability? I guess maybe we'll just go in reverse order of the speakers. I'm picking arbitrarily here. So Autumn, I don't know, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Could you actually repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is, what is your model of change? Like, how do you think how do you envision your work contributing to the fairer, more just world that you envision?
Well, I guess my answer to this question would really be my work in general as like a whole is really just to amplify the voices of First Nations people and Indigenous people, because as I mentioned a lot, Indigenous issues are not talked about. They're like swept under the carpet, and that's why I use like the main the main reason of why I do what I do is to just bring the issues that were not talked about to light, I guess, to attention, because these are important and they should not be ignored. And a lot of the issues I talk about are pretty big issues, and this, like I said, these are not issues that should not be just ignored or not looked at. And I guess another reason why I do my work is to press the government to make change, because I guess First Nations people are not looked at as important, because that's what I've kind of realized, and with the work that I've done and the experience that I've experienced, that's kind of where that's where I feel we stand, and that's why I feel like we are not taken as seriously. I guess I could say that's what I've come to realize or feel. But yeah, my work is really just to bring these issues to attention.
Great, thank you. Naomi?
Yeah, I think definitely I've been reflecting more on, I think, the importance of like trauma-informed organizing and really acknowledging how much climate change affects people's lives in the day-to-day, and how even just, I think like a lot of people who are privileged in Canada don't directly experience those effects, whereas maybe in the global south you would, or even in parts of British Columbia you would right now, and in many Indigenous communities now you do face the climate emergency in the day-to-day. But I think even just like viewing people you care about and viewing your community, people right next to you maybe like experience climate change and see it hurt other people, is a very overwhelming thing that I think stops people from pursuing action and pursuing and trying to create change, just because of how overwhelming it is. And so the importance of really acknowledging like the trauma that climate change causes, how really impactful it is to people's lives. And with that, like taking every level of care to like protect ourselves and to like just acknowledge like our mental health and how that is so interconnected to our advocacy, and how just seriously we need to take like precautions, like having like setting boundaries with ourselves as to what type of action so we don't try to do everything and burn out with that. And so sorry, and that's like one aspect of it. So having trauma-informed organizing, as well as I think this concept from Adrienne Marie Brown, which is in their book Emergent Strategy, is really emulating the change we want to see on a larger scale, at a small scale. And so really trying to create the world that we want to see on a large scale, just like in our community with the people next to us, and like Hekashan said, like with groups that we have power over in our own lives, as well as really being motivated to act for joy, for love, for protecting our community, and not letting guilt and shame and those feelings be our only motivators. And so, yeah.
I think that's such a powerful point. I mean, there's so much of the environmental movement that has started by, well, you have to consume less and you have to do less, and it's all about blaming yourself and individualizing things. Whereas what you're describing, both of you have described, as this really much more full, expansive approach to understanding how we take on this immense challenge. Kekishan, do you want to add some thoughts?
Sure, yeah, like to address the model of change question. So yeah, for us at Green Hope Foundation, the way we work is through localization, because we understand that climate change has different impacts on different parts of the world, within different nations, within different communities, for different people. And that is why we cannot adopt a one size fits all solution to address its impacts. And as I was saying in my presentation, it is an intersectional issue, and it intersects with gender, with race, with health, with water, with everything. So we at Green Hope Foundation, that is exactly how we work. We use that localized model of approach because working across 26 countries, we know that what works here in Canada, for instance, is not going to work in another part of the world. So for instance, we are official partners of the Toronto District School Board, where we provide environmental education to the children. And the topics we cover here are very different from if we're working in a community in Kiribati, for instance, which is a small island developing state, is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, where specifically our education programs, they're particularly for children who've never actually been to school, are focused on mangrove conservation, for instance, to build natural barriers against the natural disasters, the climate change induced disasters that hit them. So that's one aspect. And the other thing is that our model of change is also very much ingrained in optimism and positivity. And I say this because a lot of the messaging that goes out around climate change is that we're doomed. We can't do anything about it. And the media does highlight a lot of the negatives that are there. Of course, it must be highlighted, but what it misses out on also highlighting are the positive steps that have been taken, the actions, again, to reiterate, the ground level actions that, for instance, young people are taking every single day. Those are not put forward and those are not seen. And I think that, to ensure that people don't feel like, we can't do anything, to make sure that that mindset doesn't come into play, we have to put forward the steps that have been taken, the positive approaches and the successes, celebrate those, and then continue obviously with our work. So we really need to achieve that balance. So from my side, I would say localization and optimism.
Thanks for that. I think it's a really good point. Your point in your presentation about what gets covered and what gets emphasized is really a key one that we all need to think about. And your comments really segue nicely into my next question, which is a general one for all of you, whoever wants to jump in first, which is, how do you stay hopeful? I mean, Naomi, you said you have to set boundaries and prevent burnout, and you guys are on the front lines of the climate, struggle. How do you stay hopeful? Does anyone want to jump in? Kekishan? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So, just to build off my point of the optimism part, first of all, I named my organization Green Hope Foundation. So you can understand that being hopeful is a very important part of our work. For me personally, the smiles on the faces of the children that I work with, it's a huge motivation for me. And it's really children all around the world in urban and rural environments, because I think their enthusiasm to address a challenge is something that I think that all of us can learn from. And especially for me, starting out in this field as a 7-year-old, I know how enthusiastic I was then, and I wanted to take that forward all the way into adulthood, which I think I have. So I think that that definitely gives me hope for the future, and once again the impacts that we have been able to make on the ground. And that has also taught me that when we're dealing with a complex problem like climate change, it kind of has to be dealt with and seen it as an oak tree, for instance. Like, you plant the seed, it's going to take years to grow into a big oak tree that will provide sustenance, but it will happen. And I think that that analogy actually gives me hope as well, because I understand that it'll take time maybe to make sure that we're really able to create a sustainable world, but we just have to keep at it. And that is also something else that gives me hope, that it's a complex issue, but it is possible. And we are seeing these impacts every single day, which I see with when my team and I work on the ground. And you can see some of those images here too. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kekishan. Naomi or Autumn, do you want to tell us what gives you hope?
Yeah, I can hop on if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think it's often like this narrative that like it's naive to be hopeful, but I think it's absolutely the opposite, because hope is really difficult and it takes a long time to build once like maybe you're discouraged or once something brings you down. So I think it's absolutely not naive to be hopeful, because it takes a lot of work to build hope and to build resiliency when you feel like your change is not really doing anything, or if you feel like, I guess, like climate change continues to escalate. And so I think definitely being with community, being with Black, Indigenous, people of color, sharing space together, celebrating the small wins, having fun with your friends. I know like I'm 18, Autumn's 17. Kakashan, I'm not sure how old you are, but I know you're also in school. And so at least I feel like a lot of times the climate crisis like is such a serious issue that I know myself and my fellow like youth organizers have on our minds. But I think at the same time, I don't want that it to be something that like stops me from having fun when like, because I think it's obviously like a balance, but like we're still allowed to be kids and to like experience these important emotions. And so I think like really working together like with your community to create and be a part of solutions. But I think also something that's been really grounding for me and helped me stay hopeful is like having to constantly remind myself of like what I'm fighting for and why I'm fighting for it. And also imagining like the better world that we are trying to build towards, and how these small steps are a part of this really intergenerational line of work that we get to be a part of. And I think like Kekashan said, well, like we get to be like one brick and like adding one brick to this maybe like Coliseum or something that's being built. And I think it can often feel insignificant, but I think I feel like it's exactly the opposite, because we get to be a part of something collectively, and we get to be a part of a movement that builds towards justice for people. And I think that's really exciting. And yeah, I think definitely celebrate the small wins, because they count and they're important. And again, the small wins build to the big wins, and they can't happen without one another. So yeah.
Autumn?
I think what I would add on to that is when it comes to hope and being an indigenous activist, like Indigenous people in Canada and government do not have a good or happy history. There's been constant broken promises, and especially with the boil water advisories and clean drinking water issues. Justin Trudeau, like in the past, March of 2021, he had promised that, well, by March of 2021, he is going to resolve all boil water advisories in Canada. Of course, obviously, it's way past March of 2021. Yet again, another broken promise. So it's very, very hard to stay hopeful with the work that I do, I guess, and kind of what I advocate for, especially with Indigenous issues. What was I going to say? I've been doing this work for 8 years now, and I haven't really seen much change within government or the older generations. I feel that what keeps me really hopeful though is the younger generations and the young people and youth, because that's where I've seen the most change, in my opinion, and the most mentoring and empowerment. Because as a young person, I didn't see much young people at first, but the more that these issues were brought to like attention and were spread across social media, the more time that goes by, you see a lot more youth standing up and using their voices, which honestly gives me hope and a lot of empowerment, because the generations right now that are youth are the generations for the future, and we're eventually gonna be the ones making the decisions and stuff like that. So that's what gives me hope, is the younger generations. And a point that I always like to make is that when the message comes from a youth, it's so much more stronger, or a young person in general, because you generally would not expect a young person to speak up about these types of issues. And again, that's when I like to say something, something is wrong and something has to be done, is because children should not, or young people should not have to be speaking up about these issues. That's when you know something is wrong. So yeah, that's like a point that I like to make all the time.
It's a great point. So there's a ton of questions. I'm going to curate them very aggressively and ask that you try and keep your answers short, just so we can get to as many of them as possible. Building on Autumn, your last comments, there's a question here that says, I have a question about intergenerational collaboration. I'm curious to know about the presenter's experiences, both positive and negative, with working with adults. What, in their view, does good anti-oppressive intergenerational collaboration look like? And the adult allies are listening. Who wants to take a stab?
You can go first.
Yeah, go ahead, Kekshan.
So I've always been a very big proponent of intergenerational solidarity, because I believe that there are good and bad people in every generation. And it's important to understand that people of different generations can and do bring different perspectives to the table. So just demonizing an entire generation isn't going to work. Obviously, a lot of progress has been made in the past because there were good people who worked and ensured that we're here today. And of course, we take that forward as well. So the first good example of intergenerational work that I saw was in my parents, and understanding their perspective and the work that they had done when all throughout their life. So I knew that there are good people out there who are adults and who can support our work. And throughout my journey, like starting Green Hope Foundation 10 years ago, and then just going on with that, we've had a lot of positive experiences with adults who are in the NGO sector, in private sector, in government as well. And for us, even in retirement homes, actually, we work with nuns and priests, for instance, who used to work on the ground when they were younger, and now they're in retirement homes, but they still have so much passion. It's really amazing. But for us, it's really ensuring that we're not seen as just young people as a hegemonic entity. That is not going to work. That again goes to my point of good and bad people in every generation. Tokenizing us as just one or the other is not going to work. And I think that is absolutely crucial for intergenerational solidarity, taking away that tokenization and understanding the different needs and wants of every single person. And taking away tokenization and bringing in intersectionality, I think that can definitely help in ensuring that kind of intergenerational work. And that is what we have seen in our most positive experiences.
Wow, you three are so wise. It's really fantastic. It's really inspiring. Naomi or Autumn, do you want to maybe offer some quick responses to this? Positive or negative experiences with intergenerational collaboration?
I can, yeah. I think, yeah, there's often a tendency to, I think just because of the dynamics of often a lot of organizers who are older also being parents and having, or being teachers, and just, I think there's a strange dynamic sometimes, but I think coming together openly, honestly, just like how you would communicate maybe with somebody your own age, just seeing people as equals, as seeing people as every single person you meet, as having something to share with you, and having you can learn something from everybody new. And so I think that, just communicating how you would someone you care about in your own age, openly, honestly, trying not to project feelings about how you feel about certain groups of people onto other people. I think just trying your best to communicate with care. And I think that's the main thing.
Communicate with care. That's fantastic. Autumn, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, like as a young person, I definitely feel it gets a lot easier to connect with people that are the same age as me or around the same age. Because or with like other youth activists, it's easier to kind of like relate and like share thoughts. But with adults, it's a bit more intimidating in my opinion, because it's of course the older generation, and as a young person, it's sometimes a little bit intimidating and a little bit hard at times. But I found I've been able to connect with like women a lot more, because a lot of the stuff that I talk about have to do with the importance of women and water and like the cultural perspective, because the culture perspective of my work has a lot to do with the woman. And so when I speak about those teachings or those ideas, it's easier for me to connect with the older generation of women. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So another question from the chat here is one that I suspect you all get frequently. What kinds of activities or actions can we take to make as big an impact as possible, as effectively as possible? And maybe if you could include some climate wins that you've had to inform that answer. What do you how do you recommend people get started?
I can start again. Okay, so yeah, I did talk a lot about this. I'll answer this question. I think the first thing is educating yourself, educating your family, and educating your community. And since I am such a huge proponent of localization, it is literally impossible to say that this is the one action you can take to bring about climate change and have the biggest impact. I think what people forget is that it's sometimes the smallest actions that actually make the biggest impact. With everyone taking those small actions, you can just imagine how big of an impact that will be. And it really differs in every single part of the world. I mentioned earlier about our work on mangrove conservation in Kiribati. So for instance, if someone in Hawaii wanted to talked about mangrove planting over there, it would be met with a lot of criticism, because in Hawaii, it's an invasive species. So obviously, it's not going to work to prevent climate change there. So yeah, I think that it really differs in different parts of the world. From our side at Green Hope Foundation, I started my journey by planting my first tree on my birthday, which is World Environment Day, actually. And that was 15 years ago. So, for me now at Green Hope Foundation, we've planted over 720,000 trees. So I can definitely say that there is a lot that can be done with the smallest actions, and that's just one example. And since climate change is so intrinsically connected to so many other social justice issues, it's we're not restricted in our actions. It's like anything that you can do for the betterment of your community and your region is a way to help ensure climate justice and mitigate climate change, because at the end of the day, it affects all of us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, like Kashan said, well, there's no one solution for everybody, but I think what's exciting about it is that you can take what really interests you and what you're passionate about, what you have skills in, and take the framework of like intersectional climate justice advocacy and bring that to what is meaningful to you. So whether that's like, for instance, with different types of organizing, I know you can make like graphics, you can use your writing skills, as maybe you're in arts and you're a student, you can make poetry, art, talk about how climate change makes you feel, share that with your community. And I think really like integrate climate justice in the framework. And I think it's just like, at least for me personally, it's just like, I think changed my life immensely. And I think with the framework, you can really take it into any type of job that you have. And so, yeah, just really integrating climate justice into what you do. Yeah, educating other people in your community. And also, I think a big part of it is like that you can do right now is like holding your local officials accountable to take climate action, express to them how it's important to you. You can write a letter, you can try to set up a meeting with them, whether it's like MLAs or MPs that are like in like the region you live in. You can email them, call them, learn about like local actions that are being like held by like local indigenous nations. You can I think like support like BLM, just other organizers in your community. Really just like I know there's a lot, like for instance, if you yourself cannot be on the front lines, you can like mobilize your community to host fundraisers for the front lines. You can yeah, really, I think just like try to use the privileges that you have and use your positionality and the power that you have, and just like acknowledging like you have agency, you have an ability to do something, and like even the small things count. And but I would also like challenge you to like really question like how much power do I have? Like can I do nothing, or can I write a letter? Can I try to do something small? Can I take 30 minutes out of my day and try something new? I think it's hard, but it's worth it. And I think it's really meaningful in the end.
Great. Autumn?
I guess what I have to say about this is that like they mentioned a lot, it doesn't have to be big change or a big action to be making change. You don't have to be a public speaker on a large platform to make change or help make change. It's sometimes just as simple as making a post or sharing your thoughts and ideas with friends. Social media plays a really big part in activism and spreading awareness. And yeah, it's, I guess my advice would really just to be helping educate others, as they both mentioned, of course. And I feel it's very important to educate young people and youth because, like I mentioned a lot, like youth are very powerful, and the messages that youth can bring are also very powerful. And yeah, writing letters is actually pretty effective in my opinion, because I've written letters to local MPs, members of parliament. I've literally written a letter to the Queen and to the Prime Minister, and I've gotten responses from all of them. So I guess just sharing your thoughts and ideas is very important, and getting your message out there. So yeah.
Great. Well, we're almost to the end of our time, so I think I'm just going to take the chair's prerogative here and ask each of you to just share with us one thing that you wish you knew when you started this climate justice journey. I know this is a curveball. This wasn't on the list before. I apologize, but we're almost out of time. So one thing that you think you wish you had known, or that other people should know and take with them, carry in their hearts and minds.
I can start again. Yeah, one thing I wish I had known is that when you do good work, there are always going to be naysayers, but you really have to weigh your passion against all of these horrible bullies. And like for me, at least, my passion always wins out. And yeah, just ensuring that I do whatever I can to make a more equitable and sustainable world for all, and something for everyone else, is that age has nothing to do with capability. So stop underestimating the potential of young people and stop viewing us as a hegemonic entity. We have different needs in different parts of the world, in different communities. So and yeah, just like understand that we can do a lot of work on the ground, and we are doing it and have been creating change for years now. So recognize that.
Thank you, Kekishan. Haters gonna hate, right? You got to keep going. Naomi?
Yeah, I think I would say to myself that like people are worth fighting for, and that, yeah, just to remember that you have something worth fighting for and to come back to that often. I think I would also say that our resistance counts and it matters. And yeah, I think I would just say those things.
Great, thank you. Autumn, you have the last word.
Well, it sounds like we all kind of share the same experience, which is kind of comforting, knowing we've all kind of went through the same things. Because when I started, it was pretty hard being a young person and having adults be vocal about not agreeing with what you're saying or stuff like that. It was pretty intimidating, and there was moments where I did feel like giving up, or I almost stopped doing the work that I'm doing actually, because of how hard it can get. But I guess one thing that I wish I would have like been able to realize at that moment was everybody that does support me is supporting what I say. They want to hear what I have to say. There are people that do care. And Yeah, just ignoring, I guess. I wish I could have just been better at ignoring what was being said or negative comments. But one thing that I've learned from all of that, I guess, is that I would not be a very good mentor or role model if I was to let people get to me. And if I was to give up, I would not be a good mentor to the young people that do look up to me. Because I have kids as young as like 5 years old who tell me how proud they are of me. And so I guess I would not be a good mentor if I had let people get to me and actually make me give up. So yeah, I guess that's something I've learned and I wish I would have known.
Fantastic. Well, Kekishan, Naomi, Autumn, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. This was really an inspirational hour, and I feel very grateful to have shared the stage with you. I'm going to turn it over to Karen here, who is the official MC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and our inspiring panelists for challenging us and for starting off our speaker series on such a passionate note and such a hopeful note. So you three have already done such difficult, incredible work. We know you'll go on to continue this work, challenging systems of oppression and teaching the world about climate justice. There's always a place for you at the school cities. If you ever want to come study with us, our doors are open. Thank you, Jessica, for moderating the discussion. Thank you to the staff at the school cities for organizing, especially Liliana Bechtold, who our work study student this year, who did an incredible job bringing this event to life. Thank you to our partner Fridays for Future Toronto. And please join us for the next event in our series, Thursday, March 10th, bright and early, 9 a.m., where you'll hear about the IPCC report on cities just coming out in a couple weeks. So to learn more about us, go to schoolcities.com. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy.